The village of Netherby was a place where time seemed to fold neatly into itself. Thatched roofs clustered close together, smoke curling lazily from brick chimneys, and narrow lanes wound past gardens bursting with roses, hollyhocks, and the occasional impatient vegetable patch. One might have thought it a picture postcard, were it not for the incessant hum of gossip that drifted from the open windows and pub doors. In Netherby, everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Miss Jane Marple, a diminutive woman of indeterminate age, with a keen eye for human nature and a calm, unassuming presence, had come to spend the summer in her cousin's newly acquired cottage on the edge of the village. She was, as always, armed with a knitting basket, a supply of Hershey's chocolate gift from a travelling niece, and an insatiable curiosity that belied her gentle manners. Her arrival had coincided with the preparations for the annual Netherby Flower and Textile Show, a quaint festival celebrating the local community's skill in horticulture, embroidery, and lacework. Villagers bustled about the village hall, arranging blooms in their polished vases, pressing ironed linens on wooden boards, and fussing over the stitching of every embroidered cushion or shawl. The hall itself, a low stone building with large mullioned windows, smelled of lavender polish and the faint tang of fresh paint. Miss Marple observed quietly from a corner, her sharp blue eyes noting the tension beneath the cheerful chatter. Among the villagers was Mrs. Harriet Winslow, the show's formidable organizer, known for her sharp tongue and meticulous attention to detail. At 72, she retained the aura of authority that could silence a room with a mere glance. She was fussing over the arrangements of ribbons for the embroidery competition, muttering to herself about misaligned stitches, while a younger assistant, Clara Fenton, tried to placate her. Clara, with her warm brown eyes and nervous smile, had recently returned from the city after a stint in a prestigious design school. Then there was Mr. Reginald Clifford, the local grocer, who fancied himself a patron of the arts. He had a habit of lingering near the embroidery displays, nodding sagely and offering unsolicited advice about threads and techniques. Everyone tolerated him politely, though most quietly suspected he relished the gossip more than the artistry. Miss Marple was also aware of Dr. Leonard Harrow, the village physician, whose demeanor was as precise as his surgical instruments. A man in his mid-40s, he had been quietly observing the villagers for years, and while he carried an air of professional distance, there was something uncomfortably probing in his manner when one came too close to a secret. The final regular was Miss Sylvia Trent, a reclusive spinster who lived at the edge of the village in a modest, but well-kept cottage. She was known for her needlework, often selling delicate lace and embroidered handkerchiefs at the village FT. Her presence in the hall was quiet yet unmistakable, a serene figure, observing and occasionally offering a gentle comment on the quality of the stitching. Miss Marple found herself drawn into conversation with each of these individuals, noting, as she often did, the subtle undercurrents that were invisible to most. She could sense pride, envy, and a certain measure of fear threaded between polite smiles and polite remarks. It was, she reflected, much like a tapestry, beautiful from afar, yet messy upon closer inspection. The inciting incident occurred on the morning of the flower show's grand opening. The village hall, usually alive with chatter and the scent of fresh flowers, was unusually silent. A small crowd had gathered near the embroidery section, whispering in low tones. "What has happened?" Miss Marple inquired, slipping through the gathering crowd. "Poor Mrs. Beecham," Clara Fenton said, her voice trembling. She's been found in the embroidery room. Dead." The words fell like stones. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she made her way to the scene. Mrs. Beecham, the elderly patron of the arts and a lifelong member of Netherby's community, lay slumped over a table, her delicate hands resting upon a half-finished sampler. At first glance, it seemed a natural collapse. She was, after all, in her late 70s. But Miss Marple's trained eye detected the irregularity in the posture, the faint trace of powder on her lips, and the way her glasses had slipped askew. "Has the doctor been called?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Dr. Harrow, who had arrived moments earlier, nodded grimly. "Yes, but I'm afraid she was already beyond help. There are no visible injuries, yet I suspect foul play." The villagers exchanged glances, some in shock, some in disbelief. Netherby had its share of quarrels and jealousies, certainly, but murder was as foreign to this sleepy village as a snowstorm in July. Miss Marple, however, was not surprised. She had spent decades observing human nature, and knew that even the most seemingly tranquil communities held secrets, threads of jealousy, ambition, and resentment, that could unravel at the slightest tug. She moved closer to the body, her eyes scanning the surrounding tables. Needles, threads, and fabrics were strewn about, but one detail caught her attention: a small vial, barely noticeable among the embroidery silks. She picked it up delicately, noting its residue. "Ah," she murmured. "This tells a story, though perhaps not the one everyone expects." As the villagers murmured and speculated, Miss Marple retired to a quiet corner of the hall. She brewed herself a cup of tea, a comforting ritual that allowed her mind to untangle the threads of observation. She reflected on the characters she had met: Mrs. Winslow, whose strictness may have bred resentment; Clara, eager and ambitious; Reginald, ever prying; Dr. H. Rowe, precise and calculating; and Miss Trent, who watched silently, perhaps hiding more than she revealed. The first act concluded as the village constable, a polite but inexperienced man named Inspector Giles, arrived. He was clearly out of his depth with the subtle intricacies of human behavior and the hidden tensions of Netherby. Miss Marple, with her gentle yet piercing gaze, knew that the investigation would need more than official procedure. Human nature was a puzzle best solved by observation, intuition, and a quiet understanding of motive, skills she possessed in abundance. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cousin's cottage, her mind alive with possibilities. The murder among the threads was a puzzle, intricate and delicate, yet she felt the first stirrings of clarity. Somewhere among the villagers lay a secret, a motive, a misstep that would eventually reveal the truth. And Miss Marple was resolved to see it, piece by piece, until the tapestry of deceit was fully exposed. The morning after Mrs. Beecham's untimely death, Netherby was awake with whispers and conjecture. The village streets, usually drowsy and serene, now carried a subtle tension. Market vendors cast furtive glances at one another. Children paused mid-step to watch the police tape fluttering around the village hall, and even the church bells seemed to toll with a somber, deliberate pace. Miss Marple, as ever, moved quietly through the crowd, her soft shoes making no sound on the cobblestones. She had spent the previous evening reflecting on the scene, the small vial she had found, and the peculiarities in the body's posture. There was something in Mrs. Beecham's death that did not align with accident or natural causes, and Miss Marple intended to uncover it with her characteristic patience. Her first visit was to Clara Fenton, who was now seated in the parlor of her parents' home, wringing her hands and nibbling at a half-burnt scone. "Clara," Miss Marple said gently, sitting opposite her. "You were in the embroidery room when it happened, were you not?" Clara nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, Miss Marple. I was helping Mrs. Beecham with the ribbons. She asked me to straighten a display, and then she just slumped. I didn't see anyone else in the room, but—" Her voice trailed off. "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged, her knitting needles idly clicking. I think she might have been nervous. She was fussy about the stitching, and the new entries. I heard her muttering about someone trying to cheat, about someone taking her place as the village's foremost embroiderer." Clara's voice faltered. I don't know what it means." Miss Marple made a quiet note in her mind. Jealousy, ambition, pride, the usual threads of human behavior. Mrs. Beecham, elderly though she was, evidently possessed a streak of competitive spirit that could have bred resentment in others. Next, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Winslow, who was still fussing over the ribbons at the village hall, muttering to herself about misaligned embroidery and the state of modern skill. "My dear Mrs. Winslow," Miss Marple said, "I was wondering if you might recount the events of yesterday morning. Perhaps you noticed something unusual." Mrs. Winslow sniffed, glancing over her glasses. "Unusual? My dear, there are always unusual things in this hall, but yesterday, I confess, it was distressing." Poor Mrs. Beecham. One moment she was fussing over her sampler, the next she was gone. "I cannot imagine what possessed anyone to—" "Well, you understand." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "But sometimes even the most ordinary village folk are capable of extraordinary acts when provoked by pride or resentment." And Mrs. Winslow sniffed again but made no reply. Miss Marple, noting the rigid posture and slightly twitching fingers, concluded that the older woman might have more to reveal than her words allowed. Her observations were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Giles, who looked slightly disheveled in the morning sun. "Miss Marple, I hope you understand, the investigation is now in full swing. We have begun questioning all who were present in the hall yesterday." "Yes, Inspector," she said, "but perhaps you will permit me a quiet look at the embroidery room before we proceed. One notices small details that can elude the untrained eye." The inspector, though slightly impatient, acquiesced. Together they returned to the hall, now largely cleared of the gawking villagers. Miss Marple's eyes moved methodically, scanning every table, every piece of fabric, every stitch in every sampler. "It is not the obvious clues that speak," she murmured, more to herself than to the inspector. She pointed to a small smudge of powder on the corner of the table. "This may seem inconsequential, but it tells us something. It is from the vial, but also from someone who was nervous handling it, I suspect. Someone perhaps unused to secrecy." Inspector Giles frowned. "A nervous hand? Really, Miss Marple, we are not conducting a tea party analysis." "Patience, Inspector," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Even the smallest gesture can unravel the grandest deceit." Their attention was then drawn to Mr. Reginald Clifford, who had been hovering near the hall entrance, offering unsolicited commentary to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple approached him, noting the way he adjusted his waistcoat and cleared his throat, a performance of calm masking subtle anxiety. "Mr. Clifford," she began, "you were here yesterday, of course. Might you tell me if you observed anyone acting strangely?" He adjusted his spectacles. "Strangely? Well, one must be careful not to leap to conclusions. I only noticed, well, Miss Trent seemed rather more interested in Mrs. Beecham's sampler than was perhaps necessary. And Dr. Harrow, always precise, always meticulous. One wonders what he saw that we did not." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. And what of yourself?" Reginald Clifford chuckled nervously. "Me? Oh, I merely admired the craftsmanship. I am, of course, entirely above suspicion." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Everyone claimed the same, yet everyone harbored small secrets. By mid-morning, she had observed Miss Sylvia Trent, quietly stitching at a corner table. The woman's hands moved deftly, but her eyes were alert, watching the comings and goings of villagers. Miss Marple noted the faint tension in her shoulders. "Miss Trent," she said softly, "you have a talent for observing human nature, it seems. Did you notice anything unusual yesterday?" Miss Trent hesitated, then spoke, her voice low but steady. "I noticed that Clara seemed frightened of someone, but she would not say who. And Mrs. Winslow appeared more anxious than usual. Perhaps because she feared the show would be ruined. But as for Mrs. Beecham, I only know that she was excited about one of the new entrants, and that she seemed unsettled." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The web of tension was beginning to take shape. She could see pride, jealousy, and fear woven into the fabric of the village, each thread potentially connected to the crime. The following day, she visited Dr. Harrow, ostensibly to discuss medical matters regarding another villager, but in reality to observe and probe. He received her politely, though with a subtle wariness. "Miss Marple," he began, "I suppose you are curious about the medical aspects of Mrs. Beecham's passing. There are no visible injuries, as I'm sure you noticed, but I have sent samples for analysis. I suspect, well, we must await confirmation." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, doctor. One must always wait for confirmation, though often intuition points the way." They discussed the nuances of elderly health, stress, and the rare but not impossible effects of small amounts of poison. She listened carefully, observing his gestures, noting the slight hesitation when she mentioned the vial. As the investigation progressed, small incidents began to emerge: a misplaced spool of thread in Clara's basket, a fragment of lace missing from Miss Trent's collection, a dropped ribbon in Mrs. Winslow's study. Each minor anomaly seemed insignificant to the casual observer, but Miss Marple recognized the pattern. Someone was attempting to conceal evidence, however trivial, that could point to their involvement. By the afternoon, she returned to her cousin's cottage, her mind weaving together the observations of the day. She sipped her tea and reflected on the motives she had detected: Clara's ambition, Mrs. Winslow's pride, Reginald's curiosity, Miss Trent's secrecy, and Dr. Harrow's precision. The tapestry was intricate, but with patience, it would reveal its design. Before retiring for the evening, Miss Marple walked through the village green, observing the villagers as they whispered and watched the police activity. It struck her how ordinary these faces appeared, how serene the village seemed, and yet beneath that calm surface was a river of hidden tensions, capable of carrying someone to the most unexpected actions. She returned to her cottage with the certainty that the threads of the mystery would soon begin to unravel. Each conversation, each glance, each hesitation held a clue, and Miss Marple, as always, was prepared to follow the threads wherever they might lead. The days following Mrs. Beecham's death were quiet, at least outwardly. Netherby returned to its routines. The postman delivered letters with punctilious precision, children played along the village green, and the aroma of fresh bread drifted from the baker's oven. Yet beneath the calm, Miss Marple could sense an undercurrent of unease. Village life, she observed, had a rhythm that allowed secrets to fester in plain sight, and in this rhythm, each villager carried their own tension, some guilt, some anxiety, some simply the thrill of curiosity. The first twist came unexpectedly. Miss Marple was walking past the village hall, when she noticed a small envelope tucked under the door. The handwriting was spidery and precise, unlike the usual scrawl of the village post. Opening it, she found a note. "Do not trust appearances. All is not as it seems. Some threads are tangled beyond repair." Miss Marple examined the paper closely. No fingerprints, no name, merely the cryptic message. She felt a thrill of recognition. Someone was attempting to interfere, either to conceal the truth or to steer the investigation. Returning to the hall, she found Clara Fenton sitting alone, hands trembling as she arranged her embroidery entries. "Clara, may I have a word?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara looked up, startled, then hesitated before nodding. I don't know what to say, Miss Marple. I keep thinking about what Mrs. Beauchamp said before she died. About someone trying to cheat. I don't know if it was about the show, or something else entirely." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying the girl. "And have you noticed anyone acting strangely, anything out of place?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, "Miss Trent. She sometimes comes by my room at night, not to steal anything, I think, but to watch, to see what I'm working on. I thought it was curiosity, but now," Miss Marple made a mental note, "Miss Trent's quiet demeanor might hide an intrusive curiosity, or something more sinister." But there was another layer. Clara's own ambition, her eagerness to excel in embroidery, might have made her sensitive to any perceived competition. The next day, a second twist surfaced. Reginald Clifford, the self-styled patron of the arts, announced to anyone who would listen that he had discovered something most peculiar. In Mrs. Beauchamp's belongings, a small journal, hidden beneath the loose floorboards of her room. Inside were pages filled with notes, observations, and a catalogue of the villagers' rivalries, grievances, and alliances. Miss Marple examined the journal carefully. It was a catalogue of human behavior, noting subtle tensions and hidden resentments. While some entries seemed benign, others hinted at deeper conflicts, arguments over inheritance, whispered disputes over the placement of ribbons, and even Mrs. Beauchamp's suspicion that someone was tampering with her samplers. Reginald, however, seemed unusually eager to flaunt the journal's contents. "It is remarkable, you see," he said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "She knew more than anyone suspected. One wonders if she herself became a victim of her knowledge." Miss Marple smiled faintly. His excitement suggested more than mere curiosity. Perhaps he was trying to shape the narrative, guiding suspicion away from himself, or merely enjoying the sensation of power it gave him. Meanwhile, Harrow called Miss Marple privately, a rare concession for him. His voice, normally calm and measured, carried a subtle edge of concern. "Miss Marple, I have received preliminary results from the analysis," he said. "The substance in the vial, it is a mild sedative. Not lethal in small doses, but sufficient to incapacitate someone if carefully administered." Miss Marple's mind raced. The implication was clear. Mrs. Beauchamp's death had been staged to appear natural, yet involved deliberate administration of a substance. Someone with knowledge, or at least audacity, had planned the timing carefully. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Miss Sylvia Trent, ostensibly to discuss the embroidery competition, but in reality to observe. Miss Trent's cottage was tidy, everything in its place, yet a faint unease hung in the air. "You've been quiet lately," Miss Marple said softly, perching in a wicker chair by the fire. "Do you mind if I ask, have you noticed anything unusual in the village these past days?" Miss Trent hesitated. Her hands, which had been delicately stitching a lace doily, trembled slightly. I saw Clara leave the hall late one night, carrying something small in her basket. I did not think much of it at the time. Perhaps thread or buttons. But now I wonder." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Another clue, another thread of tension. Yet she had learned to be cautious. Often, what appeared suspicious was merely misdirection. The following day, a confrontation arose that further complicated matters. Mrs. Winslow, flustered and irritable, accused Reginald Clifford of tampering with the show's displays, claiming she had noticed spools of thread moved and embroidery misplaced. "I saw him near the samples when no one was looking," she said sharply. "And now, with Mrs. Beauchamp gone, who knows what he might attempt next?" Reginald laughed, brushing off the accusation. "Preposterous! I am merely an admirer of fine workmanship. Why would I risk scandal over a few stitches? Miss Marple observed both, noting the sharpness in Mrs. Winslow's eyes and the theatrical composure of Reginald. Each seemed eager to deflect attention, whether out of fear, pride, or simple enjoyment of intrigue. A third twist arrived in the form of a misplaced letter discovered by Inspector Giles. It was addressed to Mrs. Beauchamp and bore the seal of Dr. Harrow. The contents were brief. Your curiosity may place you in danger. Beware the intentions of those closest to you. Miss Marple pondered this. It suggested premeditation and awareness of Mrs. Beauchamp's activities. Someone had foreseen risk, and someone had acted. The letter also raised questions about Dr. Harrow. Was he warning her out of genuine concern, or manipulating the situation to conceal his own motives? By midweek, the web of suspicion had become tangled. Villagers whispered about secret visits, misplaced objects, and unexpected tensions. Miss Marple, however, began to see patterns emerging amidst the chaos. Each red herring, the curious glances of Miss Trent, the theatrical protests of Reginald, Mrs. Winslow's accusations, Clara's nervousness, served to obscure the true motive. Yet with careful observation, the true thread could be traced. One evening, Miss Marple called Clara to her cottage, offering tea and a warm scone. "Clara," she said gently, "I think you have been truthful with me, but there is something you may not have considered. Often, the person who seems most frightened or most ambitious is not the culprit at all, but a pawn in someone else's design." Clara nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "You mean, someone was using me to make it look like an accident?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, "and in these small villages, it is rarely the obvious suspect who carries the deed. Pride, jealousy, secrecy, these are the threads that bind and mislead us." As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly. The village seemed quiet, yet she sensed the undercurrents shifting. Each villager had a motive, each had opportunity, and each had a secret, but she knew, with the quiet certainty that came from decades of observation, that the final pattern, the identity of the true culprit, was beginning to emerge. It would require patience, subtle observation, and the ability to distinguish between genuine and feigned emotion. In the weeks ahead, she anticipated confrontation, revelation, and the unraveling of a tapestry carefully woven with deceit. And so, with a gentle smile and a mind alive with possibilities, Miss Marple prepared herself for the next stage. The twists had been revealed, the red herrings planted, and the threads of truth were ready to be disentangled. The tapestry of murder among the threads was far from complete, but the pattern was beginning to show itself. The dawn over Netherby was gentle, a pale wash of pink and gold illuminating the village green. The air carried the familiar scents of freshly baked bread and dew-laden grass, yet beneath the surface, the quiet held tension. Miss Marple, seated at her cottage window with her knitting basket beside her, surveyed the village in her usual observant manner. The threads of the mystery were slowly coming together in her mind, and she could feel the tapestry beginning to reveal its pattern. She reviewed her observations carefully. There was Clara Fenton, nervous and ambitious; Mrs. Winslow, proud and exacting; Reginald Clefford, ever eager to play the part of a patron while seeking attention; Harrow, meticulous and precise; and Miss Sylvia Trent, quiet but watchful. All had opportunity, all had subtle motives, but the evidence was elusive, hidden within minor gestures, slight hesitations, and the delicate subtleties of human behavior. Miss Marple decided the first step was to revisit the scene of the crime, the village hall. With Inspector Giles in tow, she entered the embroidery room, now stripped of all displays except for the empty tables and the faint scent of lavender polish. She moved from table to table, her eyes scanning each surface, each folded piece of fabric. Her attention returned to the small vial she had noticed in Act 2. There was something about its placement, half hidden beneath a cushion, that did not suggest accidental spillage. Whoever had used it had taken care to appear discreet, but had left enough evidence to indicate a subtle hand at work. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motives. Who, she whispered, would wish to remove Mrs. Beauchamp quietly, making it appear natural, yet risk leaving such a trace? She recalled the journal Reginald had revealed, full of notes cataloguing rivalries, grievances, and observations of the villagers. The person who planned the act would need access, knowledge, and the composure to carry it out undetected. Her mind returned to Clara. The girl's nervousness was genuine, and she had been frightened of someone else's intentions, yet Miss Marple sensed that Clara was unlikely to have administered the substance herself. Too young, too eager to please, and too prone to anxiety. She was more likely a pawn in a greater design. Next, she considered Mrs. Winslow. Her pride in the show was immense, but Miss Marple detected no true malice. The woman's temper and sharp tongue had caused friction, certainly, but she lacked the patience and subtlety to stage a death so carefully. Reginald Clifford presented a more complicated picture. His theatrical demeanor, fascination with gossip, and attention to the journal were all suspicious. But Miss Marple noted his eagerness to display the journal's contents. If he were the culprit, why draw attention to himself? A clever manipulator would avoid publicity, not invite it. Dr. Harrow remained enigmatic. He had been precise in his observations, cautious in his statements, yet the letter discovered by Inspector Giles suggested foreknowledge of danger. Was he warning Mrs. Beauchamp out of concern, or protecting himself from exposure? The doctor's calm composure was typical, but it concealed much. Finally, Miss Marple's thoughts settled on Miss Sylvia Trent. The quiet spinster, always observant, had been the one to mention seeing Clara with something in her basket at night. Miss Marple recalled subtle gestures, small tensions in Miss Trent's hands, the slightly deliberate way she positioned herself near the display tables. There was a calmness that, paradoxically, could mask cunning. By late morning, Miss Marple had formulated a hypothesis. She called Inspector Giles and requested the presence of the key villagers: Clara, Mrs. Winslow, Reginald, Dr. Harrow, and Miss Trent. The village hall, cleared of all decorations, became a quiet theatre for revelation. Miss Marple addressed them in her soft, deliberate manner. We have all spent time reflecting on the events surrounding Mrs. Beauchamp's passing. Each of you played a part in yesterday's observations, whether knowingly or not. Yet the truth remains, her death was not an accident. The room fell silent, eyes shifting nervously. The substance in the vial, Miss Marple continued, holding it up, was a sedative. It was sufficient to incapacitate Mrs. Beauchamp and make her collapse appear natural. The question we must ask is who had the knowledge, access, and subtlety to carry this out. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. It was not Clara. She is too nervous, too inexperienced. It was not Mrs. Winslow, whose pride would make her clumsy in execution. Reginald Clifford seeks attention and publicity, not quiet elimination. Dr. Harrow may have had medical knowledge, but his careful observation and concern for ethics suggest he would not act in such a deliberate manner. Miss Marple's eyes rested finally on Miss Trent. Miss Trent, your quietness has hidden much. You are skilled in observation, skilled in patience, and skilled in sewing, not just with thread, but with human behavior. You noticed the tension between Clara and Mrs. Beauchamp, the ambitions of the villagers, and you used this knowledge to act without drawing suspicion. A faint gasp escaped from Mrs. Winslow. Reginald's eyes widened. Clara's hands flew to her mouth in shock. Dr. Harrow leaned back, his expression tight. Miss Trent remained composed, though her fingers trembled slightly. Miss Marple continued. You administered the sedative during the flower show, knowing that the excitement and activity would mask the effects. You expected Clara to be blamed, either by accident or by inference, diverting attention from yourself. Yet small traces, the misplaced vial, the subtle residue, betrayed your careful planning. Miss Trent's voice was barely a whisper. I only meant to. She was so critical of everyone. I did not wish to harm anyone, merely to silence her. Miss Marple nodded gently. Intent, Miss Trent, is woven into action. You acted, but the threads of deceit are now visible. The motive, resentment, a desire to protect your own position, and the fear of exposure, explains your actions. Yet the cleverness required shows both foresight and skill. Inspector Giles stepped forward, taking careful notes. Miss Trent, you are to be taken into custody. Your actions, though subtle, caused the death of Mrs. Beauchamp. Miss Marple rose, her knitting basket in hand, and addressed the group once more. This case reminds us all that in the quietest of villages, even the most ordinary individuals may carry extraordinary impulses. Yet, as always, patience, observation, and a clear understanding of human nature bring clarity where chaos once prevailed. The villagers remained silent, absorbing the revelation. Clara looked relieved, Mrs. Winslow shook her head in disbelief, and Reginald muttered under his breath. Dr. Harrow nodded slightly, acknowledging Miss Marple's deduction with professional courtesy. As the hall emptied, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. She carefully replaced the vial in the evidence bag, noting its faint traces of residue, and the delicate way it had been hidden. The threads of the mystery, now revealed, had been subtle and intricate. Yet they had all led to a single, undeniable truth. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the events. the villagers would return to their routines. The flower show would continue with minor adjustments, and life in Netherby would resume its quiet, orderly rhythm. Yet beneath that calm, the lesson remained: human nature, like thread in a tapestry, could be twisted, knotted and hidden, but never entirely obscured. Sitting by the window, knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of resolution. The threads had been carefully disentangled, the motives understood, and the guilty party revealed. Netherby would sleep a little more peacefully now, though Miss Marple knew that vigilance, patience, and observation would always be required in a village where secrets could hide behind the most ordinary of faces. The day after Miss Trent's apprehension, Netherby awoke to a gentle sun filtering through the morning mist. The village green shimmered with dew, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the bakery, as if the world had returned to normal. Yet, beneath this serene veneer, the events of the past week lingered like a delicate stain on the fabric of village life. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and prepared herself for a quiet stroll. The flower show, postponed temporarily in the wake of Mrs. Beecham's death, would resume later, and the villagers were busy rearranging exhibits, polishing vases, and mending torn ribbons. Yet the atmosphere had changed. There was a sense of reflection, a subtle wariness as people considered the intricacies of human nature laid bare. As Miss Marple walked past the hall, she noticed Clara Fenton quietly arranging her embroidery entries. The girl looked up, relief and gratitude in her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "thank you for understanding. I was so frightened, and now it seems almost unreal." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Clara, fear often clouds our judgment, but truth, like a steady thread, will always reveal itself. You were an innocent participant, and the circumstances were carefully orchestrated to mislead you. Remember, courage is not the absence of fear, but the careful pursuit of what is right despite it." Clara nodded, her hand smoothing a delicate sampler. "I hope the village can move past this." "I believe it will," Miss Marple replied, watching as Clara returned to her work with newfound focus. Inside the village hall, Inspector Giles had been coordinating the final steps of the investigation. The villagers had gathered quietly, awaiting explanations and reassurance. Miss Marple, with her calm authority, took a place at the center of the hall, where she could address the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began softly, "the events of the past week have been distressing, but the truth is now clear. Mrs. Beecham's death, though appearing natural, was in fact the result of deliberate action. The substance found in the small vial, a mild sedative, was administered with care to make her collapse appear accidental." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "The person responsible was Miss Sylvia Trent, who, motivated by resentment and fear of exposure, acted to remove a perceived obstacle in her quiet but competitive world. Her knowledge of human behavior and patience enabled her to carry out this plan without immediate detection." A hush fell over the room. Miss Trent, seated near the back, remained composed but slightly pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. However, Miss Marple continued, "It is important to note that Miss Trent did not act out of malice alone. She was responding to what she believed were injustices, to a sense of threat that grew in her mind. In small villages, these feelings can fester, unnoticed, until they manifest in unexpected ways." Mrs. Winslow, ever proud, cleared her throat. "Miss Marple, you make it sound almost understandable, but she took a life. Surely there must be consequences." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed, Winslow, there will be consequences, as there must always be. Yet the revelation of truth brings a kind of justice in itself. The village can now restore order, and the threads of human relations, though strained, can begin to mend." Inspector Giles stepped forward to explain the procedural matters. "Miss Trent will be escorted to the county authorities for questioning. The evidence, including the vial, Mrs. Beecham's journal, and witness testimonies, will be carefully examined. The case is now in capable hands, and justice will proceed accordingly." A few villagers whispered among themselves, reflecting on their own interactions and hidden motives. Miss Marple, observing silently, noted the subtle shifts in demeanor, relief mingled with lingering unease, and a renewed awareness of the fragility of trust. With the official matters addressed, the flower show resumed, albeit in a subdued atmosphere. The tables were rearranged, the ribbons polished, and the embroidery carefully displayed. Clara, working alongside other participants, seemed more confident, her fingers deftly adjusting the threads of her sampler. Mrs. Winslow supervised with less rigid authority, softened by the awareness of the fragility of human life. Miss Marple walked through the hall, noting the small details, the gleam of freshly pressed linen, the careful alignment of ribbons, the concentration on the faces of young embroiderers. Life, she reflected, had a way of continuing even after disruption, and the human spirit found solace in familiar routines. Later she visited Dr. Harrow to review the final medical findings. The analysis confirmed her suspicions. The sedative had been administered in precise amounts, enough to incapacitate, but carefully calculated to avoid overt harm. Dr. Harrow expressed his professional approval of her deductions, acknowledging the subtlety of her observations. "You have a remarkable eye for detail, Miss Marple," he said. "Few could have pieced this together so thoroughly." Miss Marple smiled. "Human nature, Doctor, reveals itself in the smallest gestures. Observe closely and one sees much more than meets the eye." As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The village outside glowed with lamplight reflecting on cobblestones, and the soft murmur of evening activity provided a comforting soundtrack. She settled into her favorite chair by the window, knitting needles clicking gently, the rhythmic motion soothing. Her thoughts drifted to the events of the week. Each villager, in their way, had revealed a thread of their character, some noble, some flawed, all intricately intertwined. Mrs. Beecham's life, though tragically ended, had illuminated hidden aspects of the village, uncovering tensions and ambitions that might otherwise have remained unseen. Miss Marple reflected on the subtle lessons of human behavior, the importance of patience, the necessity of careful observation, and the quiet power of intuition. Justice, she knew, was not only served in courts but in the clarity of truth, in the unveiling of hidden motives, and in the restoration of balance to a community. In the days that followed, Netherby slowly returned to its gentle rhythm. Villagers exchanged greetings with renewed warmth, aware of the recent events but choosing to move forward. The flower show, while subdued, was completed with care and attention, celebrating the artistry and dedication of the participants. Clara, encouraged by Miss Marple's guidance, continued her embroidery with focus and confidence. Mrs. Winslow, softened by reflection, offered constructive advice rather than criticism. Reginald Clifford resumed his role as an enthusiastic, if occasionally intrusive, patron of the arts. Dr. Harrow maintained his professional oversight, quietly ensuring the health and well-being of the villagers. And Miss Sylvia Trent, though facing the consequences of her actions, provided the village with a poignant reminder of the fragility of human morality, the dangers of suppressed resentment, and the need for vigilance in even the quietest of communities. Sitting by the window one evening, Miss Marple contemplated the tapestry of events. She thought of the subtle clues, the hidden motives, and the delicate threads of human behavior that had guided her to the truth. The village, now calm, was once more a place where time folded neatly upon itself, but beneath the serenity lay a deep understanding. Every gesture, every glance, every small act carried meaning, waiting for an observant eye to discern it. With a final click of her knitting needles, Miss Marple set aside her work. The threads of mystery had been unraveled, the culprit revealed, and justice, quiet, subtle and inevitable, had been served. Netherby would sleep more peacefully, and life, in its ordinary yet extraordinary rhythm, would continue, woven carefully from the lessons of the past and the enduring resilience of its inhabitants. Miss Marple, as ever, remained content in the quiet satisfaction of her craft, both in knitting and in understanding the intricate patterns of human nature. The tapestry of life in Netherby, with its threads of pride, jealousy, curiosity and courage, had been restored to a delicate but unbreakable order.